I know that this video has kind of a strange title, Horror and Hell in the Lotus Sutra, but I felt an impulse and a need and a desire to communicate some notions about Chapter 3, the last half of Chapter 3 of the Lotus Sutra, which I recently recited. Previously, I had recited the parable from Chapter 3, the parable of the burning house, from the Wisdom publication version of the Lotus Sutra, the translation by Gene Reeves. And of course, more recently, I also recited the parable section within the first part of that chapter from the Numata Center BDK version of the Lotus Sutra. But most recently, I recited the complete BDK version of the Lotus Sutra, unabridged, the complete chapter. And what I was acutely aware of was that I had previously avoided reciting the extensive verse section in the last half of Chapter 3 of the Lotus Sutra. And the reasons why I avoided that was because of the scenes of horror within the house, as well as the descriptions of the hell that would be the destiny of persons who disparaged the Lotus Sutra. I have never liked horror movies. I have never liked the notion of hellfire damnation type preaching. As far as the horror, the things that, pun intended, bugged me about the second half of that chapter were all the references to the different insects and critters and creatures and so forth that inhabited this house that the children were playing in, and that the father, who actually is a representation of the Buddha, wanted to get them out of. But the thing of it is, what the authors of the Lotus Sutra were trying to do was to depict in very vivid form the fact of the First Noble Truth, which is suffering. That there is suffering associated with birth, old age, illness, and death. And there are many kinds of suffering that we can experience in this life. And it occurred to me, too, that back in the day when this was written, maybe 100 AD, it was a pretty tough world to survive in for the vast majority of people. They didn't have any of the modern conveniences. And even now, with all our modern conveniences, there's no immunity against tragedy in terms of physical illness, injury, relationship problems, conflict of various kinds, poverty, etc., 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 etc. So, again, we have to take this parable as a metaphor or as an illustration, as the Buddha says explicitly in his teaching of skillful means, that he uses illustrations. And what he's trying to get across, of course, is that most of us are so enamored by the desires and pleasures and things that we seek, or preoccupation with things that we want to avoid. In other words, the two of the three poisons, greed or desire or lust and anger or aversion or hate, that we get so preoccupied with these things. And because of the third poison, our ignorance, namely the taking of our self or personality as a real and separate entity and unconnected with the entire universe, unconnected with anything else, that we get preoccupied, we get focused, and we suffer because the things we try to control can't be controlled. There's a fundamental impermanence that's in the nature of reality, according to Buddhism and according to modern science. This is not a a religious belief. It's a fact. It's a reality that things change. And yet, we as human beings have a hard time accepting that, and as a result, we suffer. Now, is this a good way of describing that suffering that the Buddha wants us to be able to escape from? Well, each person can decide that for themselves, but that's where the parable is coming from in characterizing this horror of the burning house and all the things going on in it that are described in the second half of chapter 3 of the Lotus Sutra. Now, the second aspect of this video is a little trickier. I was raised in the Episcopal Church, and I don't remember the Reverend really saying a lot about hell. I mean, I'm sure there must have been some references to it, but there was no major message that, people, if they were sinners, that they would go into this horrendous place for eternity after they died. But, I live in the Bible Belt now, the southeastern part of the United States, and I'm well aware that there are some instances, if not many instances, of that kind of preaching going on. And without, making a judgment about that, I would just say that, I have always thought about hell as a mental state. In other words, as a function of getting back to the horrors, the function of our own suffering that we can not only experience but dwell in for extended periods of time. So obviously, within most religious traditions, there are precepts. Within religious traditions, there are things that are defined as bad, as morally wrong, as sinful, if you will. And Buddhism has a list of these. I don't recall off the top of my head what exactly they are. We've got the precepts, but we've also got things that are taboo, being disruptive to the Buddhist community, killing, and so forth and so on. But top among the list of these is disparaging the Lotus Sutra. That's according to the Lotus Sutra, of course. But I want to make a few points. One is that perhaps in contrast to how hell may be conceptualized by at least some denominations or churches within Christian and within the Christian religion, in Buddhism, this hell is not considered to be permanent. It's not considered to be eternal. In other words, that the notion is that you're reborn there for lifetime after lifetime, supposedly, and it can be a long period. Like in the Lotus Sutra, it talks about the person being reborn there in different forms over many kalpas. But the underlying basic message of the Lotus Sutra is that everybody attains Buddhahood eventually. So eventually, even in terms of this way of characterizing potential karmic consequences, there is a positive scenario that unfolds at some point into the future. But the other thing is to remember that Buddhism, in this sense, is not a fundamentalistic religion. In other words, when it talks about hell and all the terrible things that happen there within the Lotus Sutra, this is not to be taken literally. Okay, this is, and I'll give a quote from a website that I found that helps to clarify this. In fact, I found a couple of websites that had some good information as I tried to struggle with this and research. By the way, let me just say why did I recite this last half of the chapter on the parable of the burning house? If, in a sense, as you can tell, it's so distasteful to me in certain respects. Well, this is partly out of a wish to fulfill the parameters of the particular project that I'm engaged in, which is to recite unabridged versions of these chapters that I'm reciting. And as you'll be aware, perhaps, if you've looked at the other video that I made referencing this series of videos reciting the BDK version of the Lotus Sutra, these are then being utilized by my friend Sean in Hong Kong to be re-uploaded, republished as a result of his heroic efforts to add English and Chinese subtitles. But again, this is basically an effort to respect the integrity of this particular project by not merely reciting excerpts from a given chapter. Although you'll note that separate and apart from this other project, I did recite just the parable section of this chapter in a couple of other videos, both the Reeves version and the Numata Center BDK version. So let me comment on the fact that when the Lotus Sutra was written, the authors were very vulnerable to being called heretics, because this was a significant deviation from the earlier form of Buddhism that had been followed and promulgated subsequent to the historical Buddha's parinirvana or death back around 500 BC. In other words, you had the development of the Theravadan school, or the school of the elders, which in the Mahayana or Great Vehicle Sutras is referred to as the lesser vehicle, or Hinayana. And the reason they did that is it was a reform movement, and they were trying to tout their sort of revised interpretation of Buddhism as being superior to the former system. Although it becomes clear in these early chapters of the Lotus Sutra that the followers of that early form, which are referred to as Shravakas, in actuality, according to the Mahayana, had been following for kalpas prior the teaching of the Buddha in such a way that in truth they were also Bodhisattvas, which is the ideal within Mahayana Buddhism. But my point is this again, that the Mahayanists were vulnerable to attacks, and so by saying that the disparaging of the Lotus Sutra could result in a person ending up in hell was a way of sort of scaring people into not being too critical of it, maybe, and keeping a more open mind to the wisdom and the compassion embedded within this tremendously universal and altruistic teaching, which is the Mahayana. And then to fast forward into the Kamakura period of Japanese history in the 13th century, you had again a flowering of the Tendai school, which had evolved from the Tiantai school in China, which really had as its primary doctrine, primary scripture, primary teaching, the teachings within the Lotus Sutra. And it was a very rigorous type of practice, I think, on Mount Hai in Japan, and it spawned some of the great newer forms of Buddhism, such as Nichirenism, Zen, and Pure Land. And in particular, I want to focus in, since I am a Shin Buddhist, a true Pure Land Buddhist, on that history with respect to Pure Land Buddhism. And as you may or may not be aware, Shinran, who was the founder of true Pure Land Buddhism, his teacher was Honen, and actually both of them had the experience of working hard to try to fulfill the practices embedded within the Lotus Sutra, the ones that involved exercising extreme effort to fulfill the altruistic elements of the Bodhisattva path, and realized that they weren't able to fulfill those in a totally consistent, acceptable way. And so this is what led them to really discover, find, want an easier path for people, particularly since the Mahayana, the great vehicle, the whole point was to create means, skillful means that would make attaining Buddhahood, the path to Buddhahood, accessible to not just monks but also to lay persons on a universal basis. Now, with that context, then the question is, if you take a look at also something that was happening at the time, namely that Nichiren, who put his total focus on the Lotus Sutra, basically reinterpreted the last part of this chapter 3 to the effect that not just disparaging of the Lotus Sutra was verboten, but also following any other school or teaching other than the Lotus Sutra was a sufficient sin to result in somebody ending up in hell. Well, so, what follows from that, of course, is that Nichiren was very critical of any other school other than the Lotus, and so Honen, who was, I think, a contemporary, perhaps felt a need to justify why he was endorsing the recitation of the name of Amida Buddha as a legitimate and desirable practice for those who felt they were unable to fulfill all the idealistic elements of the Bodhisattva path as articulated in the Lotus Sutra. So what I want to do is give a brief quote from an article that you can find online. The article is called, "A Votary of the Lotus Sutra Will Meet Ordeals, the Role of Suffering in Nichiren's Thought." And it's by Jacqueline I. Stone, who's written some amazing, insightful stuff on Buddhism, particularly on Tendai and on Nichirenism. And so this article was based on a paper presented at the International Lotus Sutra Seminar held in 2013. Now, the little sentence or two that I want to read has to do with how Honen viewed the Nembutsu practice and justified it as not being a deviation from the emphasis that Nichiren had on the Lotus Sutra practice being the only legitimate practice. Honen's disciples argued that the Lotus Sutra was too profound for the people of this deluded age. They thought, several of them thought, Nichiren and Honen certainly, and Shinran, that they were in a later age of the Dharma. They were so far removed from the historical Buddha that the ability of people to understand and follow the teachings had devolved, if you will. This was, I think they called it the age of Mappo. Anyway, again, Honen's disciples argued that the Lotus Sutra was too profound for people of this deluded age. They further insisted that such statements, and this is what's important here, did not amount to maligning the Lotus Sutra, but simply reflected a realistic assessment of human shortcomings. One would do better to set aside the lotus in this lifetime, chant the Nembutsu instead, and achieve birth in Amida's pure land. Then one could attain the awakening of the Lotus Sutra there. Now Shinran, of course, took this even further, and I've talked in other videos how, from my perspective, he further refined the emphasis on other power by indicating that even the chanting of the Nembutsu was not necessary in order to attain rebirth in the Pure Land, and that rebirth in the Pure Land didn't merely mean being in an environment where one was free to study and practice in a way that could result in gradual attainment of supreme enlightenment, but rather that supreme enlightenment was attained at the moment of death. In other words, that when we die, we immediately become a Buddha and then have the opportunity to come back to this world to express compassion toward others in ways that we were unable to during this lifetime due to the kind of limitations that Honen was talking about. Now, just a couple of other sidebars on Shinran is that he actually reinterpreted the 18th vow of Dharmakara Bodhisattva in the larger Sukhavati or Pure Land Sutra, when in that vow an exception was made relative to certain sins in terms of who could be positively impacted by faith in the power of that vow. And Shinran, I think, indicated that that was only in there basically to give people some guidance on some of the things that they shouldn't do, but that in actual fact, the most evil person has the opportunity to be reborn in the Pure Land, according to this true Pure Land doctrine, by simply having faith, which faith in itself is a gift from Amida. But again, that's getting off on a sidetrack. I will say, though, that Shinran, I think it was in the Tani show, basically makes the point with respect to hell, which I guess is the topic of this video in a sense, is that he says, in effect, I should get it and quote it, but basically I'll paraphrase, is that he says, if I were capable of following any other path which somebody might consider to be superior, well, then I would have regrets if the path I am following, namely, reliance upon Amida's vow, if that leads me to hell. In other words, if I could follow any other path, then I might have regrets if this leads me to hell. But given that I don't have that capability, I don't have the ability to pursue the path that Nichiren was advocating in terms of utilizing the lotus as a basis for practice, that I'm going to rely on Amida's vow, and if it means I end up in hell, basically, so be it. Okay, a couple of other things before I close this out. There is a website put out by the Celestial Drum Tendai Buddhist Sangha. And again, Tendai is the tradition which emphasizes the Lotus Sutra. And in there's a very nice summary of Chapter 3 of the Lotus Sutra. He says, what this passage means in that context is only that to turn away from the opportunity to study and practice the Dharma in a Buddhist guise or any other is to lose the opportunity to free oneself from sorrow and suffering, but to instead continue to create more and more of the same. I really like this. I really like that he's defining hell, which gets back to my belief that I've kind of had for as long as I can remember, is that hell is more of a mental state than any kind of place or horrific sort of set of circumstances outside the context of the ordinary suffering that we create for ourselves in our minds through our ignorance, greed, and hate. So again, he says, the passage means that in this context that to turn away from the opportunity to study and practice the Dharma is to lose the opportunity to free oneself from sorrow and suffering, but to instead continue to create more and more of the same. So basically, bottom line is that we create our own hell. Now, that said, particularly for persons who may take this notion of hell in a more literal sense. I think it's important to point to and highlight one of the great, in my mind, half dozen or so top what I call cosmic bodhisattvas, and I haven't really talked about them a whole lot. This particular one, namely Kshitigarbha, or Jizo as he's known in Japan, Earth Store Bodhisattva. There's a sutra about this bodhisattva, and in general he's a protector of children, of women, of travelers, but perhaps most profoundly, he is the bodhisattva in the lore of Mahayana Buddhism, if you will, that goes into the hells to save beings who are suffering there. So he represents a great potential source of comfort for people who feel a sense of suffering, a sense of hopelessness, perhaps a sense that they've done things that will result in negative karmic consequences, etc. So, if you're interested in him, I did a video with some music background with a lot of very neat images of Jizo, and I'll also mention that I think her name is Jan Chosen Bays. She and her husband have I think it's a monastery up in the northwest of the United States, where they have a great deal of focus on and respect for Jizo Bodhisattva. And in fact, she wrote a wonderful, wonderful book about it, and I'll put the reference to that book in the description of this video. So let me close by referencing again back to this Celestial Drum Tendai Buddhist Sangha to make this point. And this is an important point, meta point, if you will, a general point, when we talk about the Lotus Sutra and how to interpret or view the Lotus Sutra, which is filled with these parables, with dramatic scenarios that are intended to teach about skillful means and about the eternal life of the Buddha, is that the sutra is written in the mythical, poetic language of early India, which is not to say that it is therefore untrue. 21st century man often disparages something as, quote, only a myth, which has become synonymous in our mind with, quote, fiction. Yet, the language of mythic poetry presents truths that are not fully comprehensible through ordinary thought. So we always have to remember that the Lotus Sutra and the other Mahayana sutras, the Prajnaparamita sutras, all these various profound sutras, obviously they are scriptures. They are made up of words and concepts. But words and concepts can never characterize accurately fundamental reality. So, the authors in their brilliance, relied upon these kinds of parabolic expressions and illustrations. Part of our practice from this website is to tease out these truths and to come to some understanding, and more importantly, experience of them. A process that will lead to different insights by different people according to their history, culture, and personal interests and capacities. And he also makes the point, by the way, that the people writing this sutra, even though they're brilliant and insightful, they're not perfect, and they have their own cultural biases and prejudices, and we have to kind of distill that out too. So, anyhow, to summarize, I thought I needed to put something out. In fact, I felt an obligation to put something out to qualify or explain how I felt and how I perceived and what my perspective was on that very elaborated reference to hell in the last half of Chapter 3 of the Lotus Sutra. And I hope that it doesn't serve as a source of turnoff to the benefits of the teachings of the Lotus Sutra itself, which, to my mind, basically transcends all religions in terms of its scope. And to make that point, let me end. I guess I promised to end a couple minutes ago, but I'm going to go on and end with a brief private correspondence that I had with somebody who was watching my videos, and he indicated, quote, "You wrote on YouTube that you chant to Amida Buddha, so why have you made so many videos on the Lotus Sutra?" I told him I think that's a great question, and here was my succinct answer, and you can take it for what it's worth. Quote, I said, "When I had a religious conversion experience in 1979, I was quite drawn to the Lotus Sutra as containing a message that transcended any particular religious/spiritual orientation. As my understanding deepened, I evolved toward much more of a faith-oriented approach, and I came to meld the teaching in Chapter 16 of the Lotus Sutra on the eternal life of the Buddha with the Pure Land teachings. In other words, my devotion to the Lotus and my sense that my, quote, conversion was a gift from, quote, other power led to a view that the Buddha in Chapter 16 was actually Amida Buddha. From there, I increasingly came to believe that, out of compassion for us suffering beings, Amida extends assurance to us of rebirth in his Pure Land as a gift of pure grace, with no actual, quote, practices, chanting or otherwise, required of us. Thus I consider myself to be a Shin Buddhist. That said, I have never abandoned my deep feeling of connection with the Mahayana tradition in general, and the Lotus Sutra in particular. I view the sutras within the great vehicle school of Buddhism as the most profound and altruistic that humans have devised, given that no doctrines can describe a reality that is fundamentally non-dualistic in a completely accurate way. So, in gratitude, I say, not as a practice, not for any desired outcome, merely to, again, express gratitude for that grace that was given to me, I say, Namo Amida Butsu, Namo Amida Butsu, Namo Amida Butsu.